Hey guys, tonight we step back into the chilly corridors of 18th century Denmark, a land of foggy harbours, flickering lanterns, and long royal names with more consonants than strictly necessary. The palace halls smell faintly of roasted herring and lavender floor wax. Gold-framed portraits scowl down at you as you tiptoe through rooms where power once moved quietly, though not always wisely, because tonight you're meeting a king who holds absolute power. Technically, a king who wears a crown, commands a kingdom, and signs royal decrees. But honestly, he'd rather be playing with a marionette or pretending to duel an invisible knight. You, my sleepy traveller, have just entered the reign of Christian VII of Denmark, a monarch so forgettable, so gloriously underwhelming, that historians often start his biography with a side notice. Oh, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, if you're feeling cozy already, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the gravel courtyard of Christiansborg Palace, your boots muffled by the frost. It's January 1766. The 17-year-old King Christian VII has just ascended the throne, following the death of his father, King Frederick Wieck, and already things are odd. For starters, the new king doesn't seem very excited. Not nervous, not thrilled, just vaguely irritated that his fencing lesson was interrupted by this whole becoming ruler of Denmark and Norway thing. Inside, the court bustles with preparations, uniforms brushed, wigs powdered, speeches rehearsed. But Christian's been sitting on a windowsill for the last 10 minutes, watching a pigeon peck at ice, muttering about how it looks like a general plotting an invasion. You're ushered into the throne room. It's all velvet drapes and ceremonial swords. The king fidgets as courtiers read oaths and heralds' trumpet flourishes. He mouths the words but doesn't quite say them. When it's time to lift his scepter, he raises it like it weighs more than his interest in politics. Later that night, over a royal dinner of boiled beef and currant jelly, Christian turns to his prime minister and asks if he can redecorate the war room to look more like a puppet theatre. No one answers. Here's the thing. Christian VII isn't dumb. He's not malicious, but he's also not quite here. Not fully. Scholars today often describe him as suffering from severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, though diagnosis centuries later is always tricky. Others believe he had autism spectrum traits or suffered lasting trauma from a lonely, regimented childhood. Historians still argue whether he was incapable of ruling or just spectacularly uninterested. What's clear is that his court immediately becomes a theatre of whispers. Ministers eye each other. The Queen Mother starts writing long letters to Germany. And in the middle of it all, Christian is busy organizing a shadow cabinet of imaginary advisors made entirely of leftover candles. He doesn't read state papers. He ignores military briefings, but he's absolutely fascinated by a stray dog that keeps sneaking into palace kitchens and names it Prime Minister Woof. Sometimes, during formal meetings, Christian stands up abruptly, walks to the window, and starts narrating imaginary battles outside. Other times, he simply walks out and doesn't return for hours. Having wandered into the palace gardens to whistle at sparrows, one courtier tries to engage him with music, hoping to draw him back into focus. It works for exactly 4 minutes, until Christian insists on composing a symphony for spoons and a broken violin string. You sit beside him during one of his more lucid moments. He turns to you and says, "Do you think trees are disappointed when autumn comes? I think they feel betrayed." There's a long pause, then he starts laughing hysterically. Still, the kingdom needs a ruler. Denmark and Norway aren't going to govern themselves. At least not on purpose. As our delicate dance begins, ministers start drafting decrees in consultation with the king. Advisors filter every decision. The king's signature becomes a formality, something to be scrawled on documents while he talks about clouds shaped like ducks. Outside the palace, life continues. Farmers tend fields. Ships sail from Copenhagen's icy harbours. But inside, power leaks from Christian like water from a cracked teacup. And yet there's something oddly soothing about his reign. No wars, no sweeping reforms, just a lot of pacing, talking to walls, and asking why maps don't have more unicorns on them. For now, the people are content. They're used to eccentric monarchs, and compared to some of Europe's more energetic rulers, Christian VII is refreshingly
uneventful, but you can feel it, can't you? That tension beneath the floorboards.
The way courtiers speak just a little too carefully. Someone's going to step in. Someone always does, but not tonight. Tonight, you rest in a palace ruled by a boy king more interested in card tricks than conquest. A king who wears the crown loosely, like a child trying on a costume. And as the wind brushes past snow-covered windows, you wonder,
what happens to a kingdom when its ruler simply
wanders away? You are standing in a corridor that smells faintly of old paper and roasted onions, both the ingredients of Danish governance, apparently. The walls are hung with tapestries, depicting glorious Viking ancestors swinging axes and taming seas.
But in the chamber just ahead, the great-great-great-grandson of those axe swingers is attempting to balance a spoon on his nose. Christian VII, fresh to the throne, and technically one of the most powerful people in Europe, is not focused.
Today, he has refused 3 meetings, spilled ink on a treaty, and asked his valet to arrange a duel between 2 decorative ducks in the palace fountain. You're trying not to laugh.
Or yawn.
Maybe both. Let's be clear, though. Christian isn't
stupid.
He's intelligent in flashes, articulate 1 minute, completely disconnected the next.
His tutors had noted this when he was a boy. He could recite Latin flawlessly, then insist that squirrels were stealing his dreams. He's a young man with enormous potential and no guidance.
His mother died shortly after his birth. His father, King Frederick V, was often drunk or distant. Christian was raised by severe tutors who treated him more like a future statue than a future king.
They forced him to study philosophy, fencing, and theology when all he really wanted was to act out plays and learn sleight of hand. Now, as king, he's finally free, and he's using that freedom to do the opposite of everything expected. This
week alone, he's played hide and seek with palace guards, challenged a servant to a foot race and won, and invited a goat into a council meeting for perspective. He adores fencing, but insists on using a stick instead of a blade, and
often narrates his battles aloud. Now, the treacherous Count of Sofa approaches.
How? Take that, villain. To the horror of his ministers, he even insists on walking among the commoners, no guards, no disguise, just strolling into a Copenhagen bakery and ordering 6 pastries, which he eats in a row while asking the baker if flour feels pain. Of course, the baker bows deeply and says, "No, your majesty." But that moment will be talked about in the city for years. The king himself,
eating pastries,
with jam on his sleeve, and yet, despite his eccentricities, Christian is strangely popular among the people.
He's not cruel.
He doesn't raise taxes. He seems
harmless,
like a well-dressed storm cloud that never quite rains, but in the palace, things are different. You linger in a hallway while the king attempts to ride a pony down the marble staircase. Nearby, his ministers are arguing behind closed doors.
The court needs direction. The country needs leadership. And Christian is trying to name the pony General Marzipan. Everyone is managing around him. His young wife, Caroline.
Matilda of Great Britain, yes.
She's British, yes. That was a political marriage, is already looking weary.
You've seen her at dinners, exchanging polite smiles, but her eyes are elsewhere, sometimes on the windows, sometimes on the clever young doctor watching quietly from across the room, but we'll get to him later. For now, back to Christian and his growing obsession with performance. He has a private puppet theatre constructed in the palace. Not a small one, mind you, a full room, complete with elaborate curtains, miniature chandeliers, and footlights. He performs weekly. He writes the scripts.
Often, there's strange parables about kings who refuse to rule and jesters who become
wise. You suspect he's trying to say something.
But when asked, he just grins and offers you a marzipan rabbit. He also starts composing little songs, most of them about animals wearing hats.
His favorite is The Goose in Golden Boots,
which he insists be played at official dinners. The court orchestra obliges, barely holding in laughter as they perform a royal anthem about poultry fashion. You see, for Christian, ruling isn't about treaties and armies.
It's about imagination.
And in some ways, isn't that more relaxing?
Historians
still argue whether his strange behavior was the result of untreated mental illness, a quiet rebellion against court expectations, or both.
Was he truly unwell or just not made for politics? In the meantime, the court adapts.
Ministers begin drafting laws without consulting him. His signature is obtained when he's distracted. You watch as an aide offers him a scroll to sign. He
dips a quill, scribbles something vaguely squiggly, and then asks, "Does ink have a soul?" Not exactly Churchill. You're beginning to understand why Christian's reign is so often described as uneventful. Not because nothing happened, but because he never really happened.
He was there, but not present, crowned, but not commanding, and
Yet,
somehow, this drifting royal manages to create a bizarre kind of peace. No was erupt. No famine spiral out of control.
the country keeps moving quietly, carefully around its dreaming king. Outside, Copenhagen continues to grow. Ships,
Still sail.
farmers still sow their fields. And inside the palace, Christian is inventing a new board game involving teacups, dice, and somehow parsnips. You sit beside him one evening as he gazes out over the palace garden. The sun is setting.
He turns to you and says, "Do you think the sun's ever tired of being the sun?"
Maybe it wants to be the moon sometimes. You nod, because what else is there to say?
You find yourself once again in the echoing chambers of Christian's Park Palace, where the chandeliers sparkle like distant stars, and the rugs are so thick they seem to muffle not just sound, but responsibility itself. It's become apparent that
This is no ordinary court,
power here doesn't roar at tiptoes.
and at the center of it all is a king who might, at this very moment, be hiding under a table. You peek beneath a red-draped buffet.
There he is, King Christian VII, ruler of Denmark,
And Norway, absolute monarch.
currently feeding a biscuit to a hedgehog he claims is his spiritual advisor. You blink.
No one else in the room reacts. This, you realize, is the new normal. You're not the only one keeping an eye on the king.
The people around him, the courtiers, advisors, and ambitious in-laws have learned to adapt to his unpredictability with
Polite smiles and quiet improvisation. They know that the real business of state isn't happening in the throne room anymore. It's happening in hallways, inside chambers, in carefully whispered conversations just out of the king's earshot. You settle onto a velvet bench beside a pair of ministers pretending to discuss grain taxes. In truth, they're mapping out a strategy to keep the economy running without Christian accidentally approving a royal edict outlawing Thursdays.
"It almost happened."
Don't ask. The Queen Mother, Juliana Maria, has begun to assert herself.
As an unofficial regent,
She's sharp, shrewd, and unlike Christian, very much aware of how power works.
with her son clearly struggling, she steps in, pushing advisors loyal to her into key roles. Meanwhile, cabinet meetings are now essentially staged performances. You watch as Christian arrives late, distracts everyone with a discussion about weather.
Clouds are jealous of mountains, and leaves early, usually in search of pastries or a particularly charming bird he saw from the window. Still, decisions get made.
Denmark continues. The king's wife, Caroline Matilda, has taken to riding alone through the palace gardens.
You pass her once, cloaked in green, eyes narrowed in thought.
She barely glances at you, her mind clearly elsewhere, perhaps already.
Calculating her own quiet escape from this puppet theatre of a monarchy, Christian is blissfully unaware, or maybe not, because sometimes, just sometimes, he says things that make you wonder, like the day he skips an official visit to the naval docks and instead spends an hour sketching a perfect blueprint for a ship design he dreamed.
His advisors stare at it, stunned. It's technically sound, beautiful, even no one ever builds it. Historians still argue whether Christian had moments of clarity, brief flashes of brilliance buried beneath layers of confusion and performance.
Was he masking his struggles with absurdity, or had he truly slipped too far into the fork?
You follow him to his private study.
The room is dimly lit, filled with scattered notebooks and drawings.
Among them, detailed anatomical sketches, political, maps with doodles in the margins, and one rather haunting poem about being trapped in a crown made of fog.
You ask him what it means.
He shrugs.
Just something the hedgehog said. The palace whispers grow louder. Some servants joke that they work for a ghost that power drifts through the halls, detached from the man it belongs to. Others are more nervous. What happens when foreign powers notice? When enemies see a chance to take advantage of a king too distracted to notice a coup?
But for now, things remain still.
Strangely gentle.
Christian continues to hold court in his own bazaar.
Way.
He invents a new dance for state dinners, which involves hopping in circles and clapping once every third step.
He insists it's how Vikings summoned courage. No one dares disagree. Foreign ambassadors are baffled. One French diplomat famously writes, "I have attended the court of a madman, and yet I have never dined so well." And so, Denmark slips into a peculiar rhythm. The king drifts. The court adapts. Laws are passed with a nod from someone who may or may not be listening, but the people are fed. The streets are quiet. and the treasury, thanks to cautious ministers, remains intact. Not great leadership, but certainly not catastrophic. One evening, you find Christian in the royal gardens, staring at a statue of his grandfather. He fought wars, he mutters. He ruled.
I feed squirrels. He turns to you, eyes briefly clear. Do you think that's enough?
You don't answer, because, frankly, you're not sure. Christian might not be steering the ship, but somehow, it's still floating, and while the nation treads water, so does its king.
Hovering between presence and absence, between eccentric and ill,
between remembered and forgotten. The hedgehog seems content.
You hear the heels before you see him sharp. Polished taps echoing down the marble corridors like a metronome in a palace otherwise stuck on a sleepy walls. The man who walks through the doors next carries no title of nobility, no inheritance,
no crown, just a small bag, a stack of medical books, and a mind full of Enlightenment ideas. Johann Friedrich Struensee is a doctor from the Duchy of Holstein, technically a German subject, and utterly out of place in the Danish court. That is, until he opens his mouth, because when he speaks softly, confidently, always in full sentences and complete thoughts, it's like someone just threw open a window. You watch as Christian 7 listens. Or,
well, he seems to listen.
He's staring at a decorative ceiling medallion shaped like a swan in a hat, but he's nodding rhythmically. That's something. Struensee isn't just treating Christian's migraines or fainting spells.
He's being invited to late-night walks, informal dinners, and royal carriage rides. He tells jokes well, sort of.
Dry ones, the kind that make the courtiers shift uncomfortably, but make Christian green like a schoolboy. Soon, he's around all the time. Not a servant, not yet a minister, but something in between. And here's the twist. Struensee is a man of the Enlightenment. He believes in reason, science, freedom of the press, education, and the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, kings shouldn't spend the state's entire budget on wigs and warships. He doesn't preach. He whispers, and Christian, too.
Everyone's surprise starts to change, sort of. There's a dinner where the king suddenly brings up freedom of speech. Everyone drops their forks. Christian then follows it up by declaring the palace pigeons should be given tiny microphones.
But still, it's the first policy-adjacent sentence he's uttered in weeks. Struensee's influence grows quietly.
He becomes Christian's personal physician, then confidant, then, well, no one's quite sure what to call him. Shadow minister, puppet master, enlightened Rasputin. Historians still argue whether Struensee was a manipulative opportunist or
an idealistic reformer who just got into deep.
But either way, you see the change.
Christian becomes a little more coherent. He starts attending meetings again, not for long, but he stays until dessert, which is progress. One night, you find the two of them walking through the palace garden. Christian gestures vaguely at the stars.
Do you think Denmark is just a snowflake floating on God's breath?
Struensee replies. Then let's make it the most symmetrical snowflake we can. It's cheesy, but it works with the king's growing trust. Struensee begins to suggest small reforms. A simplified tax system, reducing aristocratic privileges. He wants hospitals to have actual doctors. He wants legal codes that make sense, and maybe radical idea incoming education for children who aren't rich. It's slow at first.
But then Christian signs the paperwork.
He doesn't always understand it. Sometimes he doodles a duck next to his signature, but the reforms become law. You see courtiers whispering more now. Some are excited finally. Someone is modernizing the kingdom. Others are furious.
Especially the old aristocrats whose power is suddenly being pruned like overgrown hedges. But Struensee doesn't flinch. Instead, he takes things further. He begins to publish royal decrees himself, skipping the council entirely. Official documents are now signed by command of His Majesty through his position, and you can almost hear the collective gasp of Danish nobility echoing through.
The tapestry-lined halls, Christian doesn't mind. If anything, he seems relieved. More time to play dominoes with his imaginary cousin, Harold T. O. The outside world. Denmark appears to be entering a golden moment.
Intellectuals across Europe are.
Stunned Denmark, of all places, is becoming a bastion of reform, but inside the palace, the air is thick with tension. Struensee is no longer just a doctor.
He's making laws,
firing ministers,
limiting the church's influence. He even dares to propose abolishing torture, a practice still very much alive
in most of Europe at the time. Meanwhile, Christian remains a ghost with a crown, present in name, but increasingly absent in thought. Except there are moments like the afternoon when Christian personally orders the release of a political prisoner.
Or when he publicly praises a law banning press censorship, then asks,
If newspapers can also cover local goose festivals. The sincerity in his voice makes it hard to laugh. There's something strangely moving about watching a man who's been mocked as a puppet, trying to speak, however clumsily, through his strings. But not everyone is moved. Queen Caroline Matilda, for one, is watching closely. She sees the doctor.
She sees the king.
She sees the widening gap between them, and something in her begins
to shift. But that, dear listener, is for next time. For now, you glance back at the palace. Two silhouettes remain in the study, one crowned, one quiet.
The snow begins to fall, muffling the city, turning everything soft. A forgotten king, a bold physician,
and a country sleepwalking toward revolution. You wake to the faint smell of old parchment and cinnamon puns, which, in the Danish court, probably means reforms are being passed.
The halls of Christiansborg Palace feel
different now.
Quieter somehow.
Not like nothing is happening, but
like something is being carefully unwrapped, piece by piece, by hands that aren't technically supposed to be unwrapping anything at all. Struensee is everywhere now. In the council chamber, pacing softly with rolled-up decrees. In the royal gardens, chatting with scholars and merchants. Even at the Queen's side, on occasion, discussing literature in low voices. And meanwhile, the country is changing fast. You stroll through Copenhagen's cobbled streets. Posters are going up in Danish, not Latin. Court documents are suddenly written in the people's language.
Hospitals are expanding. Schools are being discussed as something other than elite hobbies. One of Struensee's first major reforms.
Ending censorship. Just like that. The presses are now free to criticize the government. It's bold.
It's dangerous. It's the Enlightenment in action. And it's happening because one doctor is signing papers in the name of a king he still forgets.
His own shoe size. You pause beside a baker reading a pamphlet that openly mocks at you. They printed this? He asks, stunned.
And no one was arrested?
Not yet, but there's more.
Torture is officially abolished. Peasant labor obligations known as adscriptio are rolled back. It's not full liberation, but it's the
first step away from feudalism Denmark has seen in centuries. Historians still argue whether this rapid-fire reformation was brilliance or hubris. Whether Struensee saved Denmark or simply pushed too fast too soon, because make no mistake, not everyone's cheering. The nobility,
furious.
The church,
deeply unsettled.
The old guard watches as their privileges evaporate, replaced by merit-based
appointments and enlightenment gibberish about equality. One bishop famously mutters, "We are ruled by a stethoscope and a feather quill." Even the Queen Mother, Juliana Maria, once content to tug strings behind the scenes, begins to stir.
This German doctor, this commoner, is reordering society, and doing it with her fragile stepson's name on the seal, back inside the palace. Christian is, well, Christian. He still wonders, still sketches birds with little hats. But lately, there's a peculiar calm about him.
As though he's let
go entirely. He no longer asks to sit in on meetings. When presented with documents, he signs them without reading, humming quietly, and sometimes you catch him watching Struensee not with resentment, but with something like awe, maybe even relief, because here's the strange thing, in the eyes of the Enlightenment, this moment is working. Struensee's vision, channeled through Christian's name, is bringing Denmark into the modern age. Quietly, almost absurdly, the kingdom is becoming one of Europe's most progressive states, all while its king organizes his sock drawer by emotion, and the queen, Caroline Matilda young, intelligent, and increasingly disillusioned, has stopped, waiting for her husband to return to her emotionally. She stopped hoping he'll notice she got a new riding cloak. She started spending more time at her writing desk. And with Struensee, you don't need to be a genius to sense what's happening. Their conversations grow longer, the glances linger, the letters exchanged become heavier. Now, historians are always cautious here. Some believe the affair between Caroline and Struensee was romantic. Others say it was political, an alliance forged from shared frustration. Still, others wonder whether it was just one of those emotional entanglements that happen when you're trapped in a palace with no meaningful purpose and too many chandeliers. But you, listener, are there. You see the hand brush just a little too long. The way Caroline laughs at a joke that wasn't funny. The way Struensee stands a little too close when reading poetry aloud. It's subtle, but not invisible. At the same time, Struensee is officially named Royal Cabinet Secretary, giving him full control over the king's correspondence and access to every corner of government. He is, functionally,
ruling Denmark from the outside. It looks like a miracle. A once unstable king, now stabilized. A country reforming itself in the soft glow of progress.
Even Voltaire reportedly nods in approval, but you feel it in the floorboards now. That creeping unease, too many reforms.
Too quickly, too centralized, too reliant on a single man whose accent still grates on the old nobility. And then there's the Queen. Gossip spreads, of course.
It always does.
A passing glance here, a misplaced letter there.
Servants whisper. Distant cousins scribble notes. By the time word reaches the Queen Mother, it's already grown teeth. Queen Consort. Possibly pregnant. Possibly not by her king, a doctor. Once a nobody. Now carrying royal favour and allegedly the Queen's. Handkerchief. A king distracted and docile, ruling only in name. It's a story made for trouble, but for now, Christian hums a lullaby he says he remembers from the womb and Denmark.
Drifts along, reformed, enlightened.
Uneasy, like a ship sailing.
Smoothly across calm waters while someone slowly soars at the mast below deck. You're back in the palace corridors, this time following a trail of soft perfume and shuffling silk.
Queen Caroline Matilda moves like a shadow in moonlight, elegant, quiet, and quicker than you'd expect from someone raised in British formality and married into Danish confusion. She's not even 25 yet, but you can tell she's already too old for this nonsense. Why now? She knows Christian won't change. He speaks in riddles, touches her shoulder absent-mindedly, and once tried to gift her a live chick in painted gold.
The romantic flame, such as it ever was, has long since been snuffed out by court protocol and her husband's increasingly erratic imagination.so. She smiles at dinners. She nods during ceremonies.
But inside, something is flickering to life. You follow her to her private study. There's a book of poetry on the table, Goethe in German. On the windowsill, a pressed
flower, still faintly blue,
and beside it, a note.
You don't read it, of course.
That would be rude.
But you do recognize the handwriting. Struensee's, it's not just flirtation anymore. The Queen and the Doctor are conspiring in more ways than one. Caroline has become a political ally in Struensee's reform mission.
She supports his policies openly, defends him in court gossip, and lends her presence to his decisions. Their relationship, whatever it may be, isn't only about affection. It's about power, shared, subtle, and dangerously visible. At court, the whispers are practically screaming. She visits him too often. She signs letters in his hand. Her maid says they meet after Vespers. Historians still argue whether the relationship was truly romantic or just an unusually warm alliance.
One letter between them describes a dream where they ride horses across the sea to a country where law and love are both just. That could be metaphor, or not, but in the candlelit corners of the palace, you sense something more immediate.
A glance across a crowded room, a smile hidden behind a teacup, the way Caroline touches the fabric of her gown when Struensee enters. Meanwhile, Christian is elsewhere some days. He's barely functional. He stares at mirrors and asks if his
reflection is trying to trick him.
Other days,
he's oddly cheerful, organizing sock races in the Great Hall and trying to teach the palace cat Latin, but one thing is consistent. He doesn't seem to notice. Or maybe he does and doesn't care. One afternoon, you sit with him
on a bench overlooking the frozen pond. Caroline walks past with Struensee. They're laughing, heads bowed close. Christian watches them, then turns to you.
I think they love each other, he says softly. You ask him how he feels about that. He
shrugs.
She deserves it. Then he throws a chunk of bread at a duck and hums a lullaby. Even so, the situation is growing
awkward. Because here's the thing about royal affairs. They rarely stay private.
And in a court already nervous about reforms
and German doctors, the Queen's involvement with Struensee, real or rumoured, is political dynamite. Caroline knows it too. She begins stepping more carefully in public.
Fewer late-night strolls. More time spent with the ladies of court. A sudden interest in embroidery. But the damage, as they say, is done. The court has already chosen sides.
The Conservatives, led by the Queen Mother Juliana Maria, are sharpening
their fans and their tongues. They see Struensee's policies as dangerous.
They see his closeness to the Queen as scandalous.
And they see Christian's passivity as the crack through which they might retain control. You feel the tension crackling now.
It's in the way people pause when they hear footsteps. The way letters are folded twice instead of once. The way the butler bows just a little too stiffly. Meanwhile, Struensee keeps pushing forward. He abolishes noble titles in legal documents.
He bans unnecessary court ceremonies.
He reforms the university system, expands poor relief programs, and begins drafting a rural education plan. And with every decree, every signature, every quiet revolution, Caroline is there, nodding, supporting, smiling that slightly secret smile. One decree, in particular, raises eyebrows. It streamlines the Danish government so fully that only the king or by proxy, Struensee, can initiate laws. The council is effectively sidelined, and the Queen Mother?
Oh, she's watching. She starts having long, quiet dinners with former ministers. She writes letters. She begins inviting certain nobles back into her drawing room. People who'd once
been dismissed by Struensee now find themselves offered tea. Even the palace guards are watching more closely now.
You see it in their posture.
Their eyes, something's shifting, but inside her own chambers, Caroline still laughs, still reads poetry, still listens as Struensee explains a new idea about land redistribution. There's hope here. Maybe even joy, but it's teetering. One wrong word, one angry noble, one stray rumor, and the whole house of cards could fall. For now, though, Caroline pours herself a glass of wine, picks up her pen, and continues writing in a journal she keeps hidden in a false bottom drawer. She writes about reform, about loneliness, about Denmark, and about a man who, for a little while, made her feel seen. Outside, the snow falls steadily. Inside, a queen dares to believe in something more. You're standing by a frost-covered window, watching the gears of the palace turn in silence. It's 1771, and the winds around Copenhagen are starting to shift. Not the weather, it's still freezing, and your boots are still eternally damp, but the political weather. That breeze, it's carrying whispers, and they're sharp as icicles. You follow Struensee now, closely, because he's no longer just a royal physician with a flair for reform. He's effectively running Denmark. With Christian VII stepping further into the shadows of his mind, Struensee becomes the one signing laws, reshaping the court, redirecting the ship of state with a confident, educated hand. And the ship is moving fast. He bans torture. He limits censorship. He institutes mandatory inoculations for smallpox, a huge leap for public health. He closes brothels, reorganizes the postal service, and begins pushing for agrarian reforms to benefit peasants, mainstream historians note. Never before in Denmark had one man introduced so many modernizing reforms in such a short span. And probably never again. But here's the catch. He does it all with almost no support from the noble class. Not because he doesn't want their help, but because they don't want his. Struensee is foreign.
He's not from the aristocracy.
He doesn't attend the right hunting parties, doesn't flatter the right ladies in waiting.
Worse, he's unapologetically rationalist.
He believes government should serve the people, not preserve tradition. Gasp, the nobles, unsurprisingly,
are not amused. They start to fear what all elites fear: irrelevance.
And nothing makes powerful people panic faster than realizing they might not be needed anymore. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You're there in the chamber the night Christian signs a decree that makes Struensee a count.
That's right. The former doctor, this upstart from Hamburg, is now officially a noble. He even gets a snazzy title, Count Johann Friedrich Struensee. Historians still debate whether this was Struensee's fatal mistake or an unavoidable necessity.
Was it ambition? A reward?
A way to make his reforms legitimate in noble eyes.
Whatever the motive, the effect is immediate. The court explodes: jealousy, outrage, mockery. One lord is overheard calling him His Highness the Hypodermic. Another paints a tiny moustache on a portrait of Struensee hanging in the hallway. Real mature. And yet, Struensee carries on. He moves into the Queen's former palace apartments. Yes, those apartments. He continues issuing decrees, sometimes more than one a day. Over 1,000 in just under 2 years. You read that right, but now the reforms are hitting harder.
Clergy privileges
trimmed, guild monopolies broken,
peasant rights expanded,
and all
of it is signed by a king who barely understands what's happening because Christian VII, bless him, has mentally checked out.
Some days he plays cards with shadows.
Other days he stands on the balcony, reciting the names of birds that don't exist. You see the danger, right?
Struensee holds power, but he's not the king. Caroline Matilda is the queen, but she's English,
foreign, and now scandalously close to Struensee.
And the nobility?
Oh, they are sharpening knives figuratively, of course.
For now, Juliana Maria, the Queen Mother, sees an opening. She's been quiet,
polite,
not in the spotlight.
but she's been building alliances, especially with the military and conservative factions in court.
All it takes is one night of resolve, one clever move, and the whole reform machine could grind to a halt. Still, for a brief, flickering moment, things seem almost utopian. Struensee has Denmark moving toward enlightenment. Caroline believes change is not just possible, but imminent. Even the people, many of whom have seen real improvements, less censorship, war protection, start murmuring that this strange, quiet government might not be so bad after all. There's even a party to celebrate the anniversary of reforms. Lanterns light up the cobbled streets. A small orchestra plays outside.
You hear laughter in the cold night air, genuine, bright laughter, and then a pamphlet appears. You pick it up off a barrel near the fish market. It's anonymous, of course, but it's Vicious.it calls Struensee a tyrant, a seducer, a foreign
Puppet master who bewitches the queen and manipulates the king like a ventriloquist dummy. Worse, it implies that their child Caroline and Christian's son is actually Struensee's. There's no evidence. The timelines don't quite match.
but rumor is more powerful than fact, and this one sticks. By the time the sun sets, there are 20 more pamphlets.
By the next week, over 100, even the commoners, once quietly hopeful, begin grumbling. The reforms came too fast. The taxes
Are confusing.
The German count is arrogant.
And who knows what goes on behind those palace doors, That's the thing about revolutions. However polite, they always risk backlash. And now that backlash is heating up inside the palace, the tension is thick enough to batter your toast with. Guards exchange knowing glances. Caroline receives fewer curtsies.
Struensee looks tired, paler. He writes in his journal about being pursued by shadows in daylight. Even he knows it's all starting to unravel. And Juliana Maria? She smiles over her teacup, because the next move will be hers. The hallways are too quiet tonight.
The kind of quiet that makes your breath sound suspicious.
You pad softly over polished floors, the candle in your hand flickering with every step, and you can feel it. Something's changed. You pass a portrait
Of King Christian IV, bold in armor, and beneath it, a fresh gust of drafty air sneaks under the doorframe.
The hair on your arms lifts, because in this castle, whispers now have weight.
And fear doesn't walk it tiptoes. And tonight, it's creeping straight toward Johann Friedrich Struensee. It's January 1772. Cold enough to freeze your socks mid-stride.
But the coldest thing in Copenhagen isn't the wind, it's the growing silence around the queen and her physician lover, Juliana Maria. The late king's widow and mother to Prince Frederick has been patient,
Strategically quiet. But behind closed doors, she's been gathering a tight ring of nobles, military officers, and churchmen. Men who are sick of reforms. Men who miss power. Men who, frankly, just don't like being bossed around by a guy who was giving flu shots. 5 years ago, historians still argue whether Juliana was the mastermind or simply the catalyst. But either way, the plan is in motion. Here's how it starts. The palace guard has been quietly replaced with soldiers loyal to her. Officers with family names carved into Denmark's old bones.
and most importantly, she has Prince Frederick, her son, waiting in the wings, a teenager. Yes, but pliable and noble-blooded.
A blank canvas for old-school rule.so. What do you do if you're Juliana and you want to reclaim power without causing
Civil war? Easy. You whisper to the king, and that's exactly what she does. Christian 7, lost in his own haze, is surprisingly receptive. Maybe because Juliana speaks softly. Maybe because she's one of the few who still treats him like a person, not a puppet.
Or maybe because she slips something calming into his wine, no proof. Just rumors. But let's not pretend this palace hasn't played dirtier games before. In the dead of night, the plan is set. Struensee and Caroline Matilda must go. It happens.
Fast. You're watching from the hallway as heavy boots thunder past. Doors slam open.
Velvet curtains shudder. A pair of guards in grey-blue uniforms grabs Struensee mid-dream. He's still in his nightshirt, her wild confusion plastered across his face. He doesn't fight, he just keeps repeating, "I've done nothing wrong." But in court, wrong is whatever the winner says it is. He's dragged to Costelet.
A star-shaped fortress that looks quaint from a distance, but holds cells colder than a nun's smile. They throw him in without ceremony, and the door slams shut behind him with the kind of finality that echoes into your stomach. Next they come. For Caroline Matilda, she's in her apartments, half-dressed, a letter to her mother still open on the desk.
She doesn't scream, but her eyes wide, stunned flash with royal fury. But there are no allies left. The nobles have flipped. The staff has gone quiet.
Even her own ladies in waiting step back, skirts brushing the walls. They exile her too. Cromwell Castle, the same fortress Shakespeare borrowed for Hamlet, and boy, is that poetic overkill.
It's windswept, gloomy, and full of empty corridors that seem to whisper. You shouldn't have trusted anyone. Within hours, Copenhagen knows. The streets burst with the news.
Pamphlets multiply like rabbits in spring. Traitor physician. Arrested.
Queen's immorality revealed. One even has a drawing entirely fabricated, of course, of Struensee whispering policy into Caroline's ear, while the king sleeps behind them with a clown's hat on. Quirky tidbit. Some of the pamphlets claim Struensee and Caroline practice black magic.
Actual accusations of moonlit rituals, chanting, and enchanting.
Because apparently, a woman with opinions and a smart man with glasses can only be explained by witchcraft. The
public, once cautiously intrigued by the reforms, turn sour.
Bread prices are up, taxes feel unfair. And hey, wasn't that foreign guy shutting down all the fun old traditions anyway?
Even the reforms themselves start unraveling.
New decrees are burned, old laws restored.
Torture is back on the books.
And censorship locks its teeth around the press like a starving hound. Struensee, now isolated, writes letters, some plead, some defend, all ignored. Caroline begs for a fair trial. The court laughs behind doors, and then comes the trial, sort of. More like a performance. Struensee is accused of over 100 crimes, from political overreach to, of course, adultery with the Queen. The king is present, but dazed, nodding at the
wrong times. Caroline isn't allowed to testify. Historians still debate how much of the evidence was fabricated or manipulated. Some say the so-called love letters between them were planted. Others believe they really were lovers, but argue reasonably that private affection shouldn't lead to execution. Doesn't matter now. The verdict was written long before. The trial began. Struensee is sentenced to death. Caroline is sentenced to exile. And you're standing at the window of a tall stone building, watching it all unfold below in awful tragic detail. The date is April 28th, 177 to dot a T the public square. A scaffold waits. The crowd is huge, restless, caught between justice and spectacle. Struensee arrives, pale but composed. His hair has been cut. He wears a simple coat.
One observer says he walks like a man already elsewhere, they say here.
Confessed.
Or maybe they forced him to.
Either way, his head is separated from his body in the Danish tradition cleanly, formally, and just like that, the age of reform in Denmark slams shut like an iron gate. Caroline, meanwhile, is shipped.
Off to cell in northern Germany. Exiled. Her children taken from her.
She never sees Denmark again. She dies at 30 young, tired, and still defending her name, but in the palace. Juliana Maria walks with new confidence. Prince Frederick is installed as regent. The old order returns, stiff-backed and smug, and King Christian, he smiles politely at no one.
You still hear echoes in the halls, don't you? After a drama like that midnight arrests, royal betrayal, a beheading with public flair, it's tempting to think the story's over.
Curtains closed. Justice done, however uneven. The villain is dead. The Queen is banished. The power-hungry regent step into place, but Denmark doesn't wake up the next day renewed. No glorious dawn breaks over Copenhagen. Instead, it just keeps going, and you trudge along with it, because this isn't the story of a great rise or fall. It's the story of what happens after the climax, when the air's been knocked out of the kingdom's lungs, and nobody quite knows what to do with the silence. Juliana Maria, now the real power behind the throne, sets to work. Alongside her, close ally, Ovheg Goldberg, a name that sounds like someone carved halfway through a sentence. She begins slowly undoing nearly everything Struensee touched. Where once there were radical reforms, now there's rollback. Where there was free speech, there's censorship.
Where laws had been clarified and made more humane, they become once again tangled in ancient dusty precedent. And Christian 7.
He continues to float through the days like a balloon someone
forgot to tie down. He signs what he's told to sign. He nods when prompted.
Occasionally, he mutters a witty aside, and the court laughs a little too hard, a little too nervously. After all, nobody wants to be on the wrong end of a royal tantrum, or worse, be accused of disturbing the carefully curated illusion that the king still rules. Historians still argue whether Christian's condition worsens over time, or merely
becomes more visible now that Struensee is no longer shielding it. Some say he has lucid days and even moments of sharp insight.
Others claim he is nearly catatonic, spending hours staring at candle flames or whispering to portraits. Either way, the regency becomes permanent. Juliana, Maria, and Goldwick rule Denmark through Prince Frederick, now elevated as Crown Prince Regent. Frederick's barely 15. He sits in meetings, not obediently, signs papers handed to him by Goldwick, and dreams, perhaps, of someday
being more than a ceremonial cushion warmer. Meanwhile, the Danish people aren't exactly celebrating. Struensee's reforms had their flaws. Some were rushed, others poorly communicated, but they had momentum. They pointed toward modernity.
They lit a spark that said, hey, maybe we don't have to do things like it's 1640 anymore. And now?
That spark is snuffed.
The wind that blows over the country is stale, perfumed with old money and old fear, quirky detail. One of Goldwick's first acts is to restore elaborate court rituals that Struensee had deemed wasteful. Things like the precise number of footmen needed to open a door 3, or the official length of a royal bow to seconds, held.
There's even a debate about whether the king's nap schedule should be published daily in court bulletins.
To preserve transparency of divine rest. Yes, really. So as Denmark creeps into the late 1770s, it does so under a cloud of stagnation. New ideas dry up. Science takes a back seat.
Education reforms stall.
Even the architecture, once bold and
evolving, starts looking like copies of Baroque blueprints. It's a reign of elegant nothingness,
of silk-trimmed sameness, and you can feel it in the way time stretches. Every event, every law, every public ceremony becomes predictable,
lifeless.
A performance of governance without the risk of progress, and yet, somehow, it keeps going. That's the part that gets under your skin, isn't it?
Because you'd expect all this hollow pomp to collapse under its own weight, but it doesn't.
It coasts, like a carriage going downhill, no engine, just inertia. And here's the strange thing. This might be exactly what many people want after the chaos of the Struensee affair. Rushed decrees, noble revolts, a queen's scandal splashed across Europe. Many Danes crave something boring, something safe, even if it means embracing mediocrity with both arms. So Denmark becomes a land of hushed hallways, quiet obedience, and meticulous routines. It's during this time that foreign ambassadors begin reporting back to their courts about the haute air in Copenhagen. One British envoy writes, "The king smiles at nothing, the queen mother smiles at everything, and the boy prince smiles only when Goldwick allows it. Chilly, huh?" And yet, the machine hums on.
Bureaucracy, inertia, and carefully managed public relations
keep the kingdom afloat, but the outside world isn't slowing down. The American colonies are on fire with revolution. France is bubbling toward its own. Even neighboring Sweden is experimenting with more democratic reforms.
And Denmark is still arguing about how many candles should be lit during royal dinners. Historians still debate whether Goldwick
and Juliana Maria missed their moment or simply feared change too much to risk it. But one thing's clear. By keeping everything so tightly controlled, they also freeze progress in amber, and underneath it all, beneath the velvet and powdered wigs, the cold meat banquets and curtain carriage rides, something is shifting. Frederick is growing up. He watches,
learns. He sees how power can be worn like a costume.
He notices that everyone around him bows to his title, but not to his mind. And maybe, just maybe, he's waiting, because every regency eventually ends. The wheels don't screech. They don't even squeak when change comes to Denmark again. It tiptoes in like a cat across a marble floor, and you're there, watching it all unfold, not with fireworks or revolution, but with the slow, deliberate
tension of a scene change in an overlong play. Crown Prince Frederick turns 18 in 1784, theoretically. This means he's now old enough to rule.
In practice, not so much. Juliana, Maria, and Goldwick aren't handing over the reins just because a birthday cake says so. They've spent years building this cozy kingdom of control, polishing its routines like silver. Why give it up?
But Frederick isn't the wide-eyed boy he was when Struensee fell.
He's grown up inside a palace of ghosts. He's met father,
his exiled mother, his executed would-be stepfather, and he's been watching,
waiting, and quietly. He's been gathering allies. He's got to key things going for him. He's not visibly incompetent. Unlike his father, he can hold a conversation, remember names, and form coherent sentences without suddenly shouting at chandeliers. People are bored.
Not angry, not rebellious, just bored. The nobles miss intrigue.
The public misses momentum. Even the palace pigeons probably miss scandal.so on April 14, 1784. Frederick makes his move. It happens in the Council of State, a room you imagine must smell like candle wax and self-importance. Juliana Maria isn't there, neither is Goldberg, just a handful of ministers and the Crown Prince. He simply walks in and declares, "I'm assuming power now. Technically, it's within his right. Legally, the regency has expired, but it's still a gamble. What if they refuse? What if someone calls for the guards? Instead, something almost weirder happens. They let him. There's a pause, a shuffling of papers, an awkward clearing of throats,
and then quiet assent.
no shouting, no coup.
No thrown goblets, just like that. The long shadow of the regency lifts. Historians still argue whether the ministers supported Frederick out of genuine faith or pure fatigue.
But the result is the same. Goldberg is dismissed. Juliana Maria is pushed into quiet retirement, and Denmark, at last,
Gets a new kind of king. Well, sort of. Frederick technically still reigns under the title Crown Prince Regent, since Christian
VII, remember him, is technically still king, but the reality is reversed now.
the son governs.
The father disappears behind embroidered curtains, and with that change comes a slow but steady thaw. Frederick isn't a firebrand like Struensee. He doesn't leap into radical reforms or toss powdered wigs out palace windows.
But he's thoughtful,
Pragmatic.
and perhaps most crucially he listens to people smarter than himself, like Andreas Peter Bernstorff. Now there's a name with. Staying power. Bernstorff had been a statesman before Struensee, survived during the regency by keeping his head down, and returns now as one of Frederick's key advisors. He's calm, cautious, and committed to modernizing Denmark, just not all at once. Under their leadership, reforms begin to breathe again, not with the chaos of Struensee's whirlwind, but with quiet deliberation. Education gets attention.
Trade opens. Bureaucracy becomes less tangled, and most dramatically, something big happens in 1788. The abolition of serfdom in Denmark. That's not a typo. Not discussion. Not maybe someday. Actual. Legal abolition of serfdom.
Peasants are no longer bound to the land like medieval NPCs.
They can move, own,
Lease, make choices. It's massive. It's also weirdly
peaceful. No revolts. No fiery pamphlets.
just a policy quietly rolled out across the countryside. One historian describes it as the quietest social revolution in European history. Another says, Denmark reformed by whisper. You like that, don't you? But don't get too cozy, because this isn't a redemption arc for Christian VII. He's still there. Physically, sometimes he appears at state functions, blinking in the sunlight like a man waking from a decades-long nap.
He waves awkwardly.
Misbuttons his coat, maybe recites a poem backwards, and then vanishes again. One French diplomat visiting in the 1790s describes the king as a polite ghost. Another swears Christian once tried to conduct a silent orchestra during a banquet. No one dared tell him there were no musicians. Quirky tidbit. One legend claims Christian insisted on being addressed with fresh titles daily, protector of
Cloud thoughts. Duke of Tuesday, and once, Lord of the Unfinished Sentence. Historians still debate whether these stories are exaggerated or painfully real. What's real is this. Christian VII's reign technically continues until 1808. That's for decades on the throne, the vast majority spent being ruled for. You've got to admit it's kind of poetic.
a kingdom kept afloat not by its monarch, but by those orbiting him.
A king whose name remains on the coins while others write the laws, and you're still here, following along, because now the story shifts again. As Frederick's quiet modernization takes root, Denmark begins to position itself differently in Europe. Less isolationist, more engaged, diplomatic, soft-spoken, but not invisible. And yet, you can't shake the sense that something is still off. Maybe it's the lingering presence of Christian VII, like a statue no one dares move. Or maybe it's the eerie feeling that all of this, the rise, the fall, the return has unfolded in a bubble. Outside, the world is changing rapidly. France is about to explode.
Napoleon will rise soon.
Empires will crumble.
And Denmark
Is trying to remember how to breathe after holding its breath for most of a century. But hey, you've made it this far. You've watched a mad king crowned.
a radical reformer rise and fall, a regency stiffen like we cold bread, and now a cautious young man picking up the pieces, and still the candles in the palace burn.
The guards change.
The pigeons return to their favorite roof, because history doesn't always end in a bang.
Sometimes it ends with a long exhale.
You wake up figuratively, of course in the year 1790, and even though the world is hurtling toward chaos, Denmark is still politely adjusting its collar in the mirror. Frederick continues ruling as regent, a role he wears like a well-tailored but slightly too modest coat.
The man is efficient, fair, maybe a little boring sort of like if your accountant were also in charge of a small Scandinavian nation. But after the last few decades of rollercoaster governance, boring is kind of refreshing. Remember how we ended? With Denmark cautiously peeking out into the wider world. Well, that window's about to swing wide open and smack someone in the face, because across the North Sea, something big is happening. The French Revolution. Heads are rolling in Paris. Monarchs everywhere are suddenly checking their necks in the mirror. The age of enlightenment is throwing a rave, and Denmark is standing by the snack table, wondering whether to join in. Frederick and his ministers don't panic, but they do tighten things up. Reform? Sure.
Radical upheaval.
Hard pass. They're not keen on importing guillotines. Still, the revolution sends ripples. People start reading different books, whispering different ideas.
Peasants remember that they have newly won freedoms, and some start asking awkward questions like, why don't we get more say in things? You can't help but admire the balance Denmark tries to strike here. Cautious progressivism without
the fire, modern ideals without losing its cool. It's like trying to do yoga on a ship deck during a storm. One area they actually innovate, embrace yourself, is agriculture. Yes, we're talking crop rotation, land management, soil surveys. Don't fall asleep just yet, because these reforms matter. They feed people more efficiently.
They reduce famine risk, and they help lay the groundwork for Denmark's eventual transformation into one of the world's most efficient food exporting societies. A quirky tidbit for you. One of the most influential agricultural reformers at the time was a man named Count Ernst Heinrich von Schimmelmann, who not only reorganized farming practices, but also threw lavish dinners where guests were forced to eat turnip-based meals in tribute to Denmark's humble soil. Historians still debate whether the turnip feasts were a PR stunt or an actual
obsession. Either way, they happened. Meanwhile, Christian VII is
still alive. Yep, he's drifting around the palace, now well into his 40s, sometimes lucid enough to nod at courtiers, sometimes lost in conversations with paintings. There's even a report of him being found sitting in an empty council chamber, reciting laws from memory while wearing two different shoes. But there's something almost ghostly about him now. You picture him as a walking echo of an earlier Denmark, though.
Last physical trace of a turbulent past that no one wants to revisit, but no one dares fully erase. And in that space between presence and absence, Frederick keeps governing. In 1792, something extraordinary happens, something that barely makes a ripple at the time, but will resonate centuries later. Denmark becomes the first European country to officially prohibit participation in the transatlantic slave trade. Not slavery itself, not yet, but the trade. It's a significant move, especially considering that Denmark still owns colonies in the West Indies, where enslaved
labor is part of the economy, but the law marks a clear break from the more brutal tides of European commerce. Of course, enforcement is another matter. Some Danish ships continue illicit trading under other flags, and historians still argue whether the ban was moral, economic, or just a clever way to seem progressive without disrupting too much sugar. Still, it's real. It's early, and it's a turning point. You can almost feel the country's posture
shifting,
less about rigid hierarchy, more about managed progress.
Less court intrigue, more public policy. But Denmark's not out of the woods.
Because all this peace and quiet,
it won't last. Napoleon is rising in France like a puff pastry that refuses to be ignored.
War is sweeping across Europe,
and tiny
Denmark is about to get caught between giants. But not just yet. For now, the late 1790s are Denmark's last calm stretch. The regency hums quietly.
Trade increases.
Peasant life improves, albeit slowly.
Even the arts get some love. Romantic poets, nature painters, and composers start to shape a distinctly Danish cultural identity. One composer you might hear echoing through the halls of a Copenhagen parlor is Friedrich Schiller, known for his flute sonatas and for being really good at pretending he was born in Denmark he wasn't. Even the Crown Prince Regent himself begins to show interest in the arts and national development. And all the while, Christian VII remains the silent CEO star in this long, strange play. Occasionally, he'll make a public appearance. A slow wave, a vacant smile. People will whisper, He's still with us, as though talking about a fragile grandfather at Christmas dinner. But inside the palace, there's no delusion about who runs Denmark. You begin to feel it, don't you? The sense that the nation has matured not spectacularly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tree finally rooted after decades of being buffeted by winds, fires, and rogue botanists. Yet the shadow of conflict is creeping closer because, when Napoleon invades, neutrality becomes a gamble, and Denmark's calm waters won't stay still for long. For now, though, exhale. Let the candlelight flicker. Let the garden reforms grow their turnips. Let Christian 7 wander one more hallway in silence, because peace, however brief, is a kind of triumph. So here you are again, drifting into the early 1800s, when Denmark, like a cautious wallflower at a violent party, is doing its best not to get stepped on by Napoleon's very large boots. You're still in the long shadow of Christian 7's reign, though by now it's almost comical to call it his. The man is still technically king, still very much alive if you could call existing in a state of confused limbo, living, but his son, Crown Prince Frederick, has been handling everything. Important for over 2 decades now, and good thing too, because the clouds are gathering. Napoleon's ambitions are reshaping Europe. He's toppling monarchies like dominoes, redrawing borders with all the delicacy of a toddler with a crayon. Denmark, staunchly neutral so far, tries to do the diplomatic equivalent of tiptoeing past a sleeping lion. It's not going to work. The British, deeply suspicious that Denmark might lean French, decide to act first. In 1801, without so much as a knock-knock, anyone home, the British Navy sails right into Copenhagen's harbour and starts shooting. This becomes known as the Battle of Copenhagen, and it's not just a naval tiff, it's a full-blown, cannon-blazing warning, led by none other than Admiral Horatio Nelson. Yes, that one. The British force demands Denmark surrender its fleet to prevent it from falling into Napoleon's hands, and because Denmark refuses, boom, the city is shelled. Danish ships are sunk, hundreds die. You can almost hear the hiss of splinters and fire against the wind. Buildings shake, civilians flee. It's the kind of historical moment that makes your blood run cold, not because it was senseless, but because it was preemptive. Historians still argue whether this act of aggression was a necessary military precaution or just classic imperial overreach. To Denmark, it's a national trauma. Neutrality has failed. The world won't let them sit this one out, and it's not even the last time the British will drop by uninvited. Fast forward to 1807. Denmark still hasn't picked a side, but this time, the British don't ask politely or at all, they bombard Copenhagen again, and this time it's even worse. Civilian neighborhoods are shelled indiscriminately. Fires rage. Children are buried in rubble. Over 2,000 people die. The Royal Danish Navy is captured and towed away like someone stealing your entire garage. And here's the twist. Denmark still hadn't allied with Napoleon. It's like being punched in the face because someone thought you might someday glance at their nemesis. After this, Denmark has no choice. It joins Napoleon's side not out of love, but out of resentment. If you're going to get punished like an enemy, you might as well be one. This leads to what's known as the Gunboat War, a lesser known, but utterly bizarre maritime conflict between Denmark and Britain. Picture it. Denmark has no navy left, so it builds small gunboats like angry little tugboats with cannons and starts guerrilla attacks along the coast. It's David versus Goliath. If David had a fishing boat and Goliath had a fleet of ships of the line, it's brave. It's desperate. It's not particularly effective, but it does give Denmark a weird kind of pride. Scrappy resistance becomes part of the national story, and despite the odds, Danish gunboats manage to inflict some damage. Meanwhile, the rest of Denmark suffers. Trade collapses, poverty spreads, entire towns face famine. The once genteel kingdom becomes a battlefield of hunger and disease. And, behind palace walls, Christian 7, oblivious to it all, continues his ghost-like wandering. Crown Prince Frederick, now more war manager than monarch in waiting, does what he can. He coordinates famine relief. He oversees rebuilding efforts. And he tries mostly in vain to keep Denmark afloat amid the storm. A quirky side note. During this war-torn decade, Danish scientists still manage to make progress in meteorology and botany. There are actual journals from the time documenting rainfall patterns and plant taxonomy, written with calm precision while cannonballs fly outside the window, because when you're Danish, even wartime chaos is no excuse to stop observing cloud formations. Eventually, in 1813, things hit rock bottom. Denmark declares state bankruptcy. Yep, the country literally runs out of money. Inflation explodes. The krona collapses.
Families who'd saved for decades find their fortunes reduced to meaningless paper. You picture it. Old shopkeepers staring in disbelief at the worthlessness of their coin purses. Children playing with banknotes like scraps
Of paper. It's not just economic, it's existential. And then, just to sprinkle some salt on the wound, Denmark is forced via the Treaty of Kiel in 1814 to cede Norway to Sweden. It's a major loss. Denmark and Norway had been linked for over 400 years. Think about that, entire generations born, lived, and died under a single dual monarchy. Now, it's over. The northern spine of the kingdom is gone. People mourn it like a death. Frederick, still not technically king yet, oversees all this with a quiet, determined face. He doesn't panic. He doesn't flee. He just absorbs the blows and starts looking ahead. Meanwhile, Christian VII finally dies in March 1808. Mid-conflict, there's no great drama, no final proclamation. Just the passing of a long-absent shadow. A reign that lasted nearly half a century, much of it in silence, finally ends. And with that, Frederick becomes Frederick VR, officially King of Denmark. And no longer regent. No longer acting. No more shadows between him and the crown. His inheritance, a kingdom in economic ruin, scarred by bombardment, and stripped of half its territory. But also a nation that survived, barely, yes. Bitterly, perhaps, but survived, nonetheless. And just when you think the story might drift into another fog of hardship, something unexpected happens. People rally, communities begin rebuilding. New schools are opened. The first real sense of Danish nationalism starts to flicker, not tied to royalty or territory, but to identity, to language, to resilience. There's something deeply moving about it. You picture a carpenter rebuilding his storefront, a mother teaching her children letters from salvaged books, a former sailor planting turnips, quietly humming the melody of an old folk song, a country stitched back together with human hands, and for once, the king isn't the center of the story. Not really, because Denmark is becoming something else, something not entirely defined by monarchy, war, or loss. It's becoming Danish. By now, you're drifting through a Denmark that has just barely survived the worst, and yet, somehow, it's entering a period that history will come to describe with words like stability and calm. Which, considering everything that just happened, feels a bit like describing a shipwreck as moist but structurally intriguing. Frederick VR is finally king. For real this time. Not regent, not acting monarch, not the polite guy standing just behind the throne. No, now it's his turn to wear the crown, and unlike his father, he actually knows what day it is. But don't expect any royal fireworks. Frederick VR is many things competent, diligent, a lover of music and education, but dramatic is not one of them. He's the kind of ruler who sends long memos, reads them twice, and probably insists on punctuality at cabinet meetings. The guy you want running a government during tax season, not during a Viking raid.so. What does a king do with a nation that's lost Norway, been bombed twice, gone bankrupt, and has a population still blinking in the smoke of war? He starts by telling everyone to breathe, literally. In one of his first major moves, Frederick supports a nationwide return to farming, education, and local industry. He invests in schools. He encourages agricultural reform. You're picturing it now. A field of wheat rippling in the breeze. A young boy tracing letters on a chalkboard. An elderly woman selling hand-spun wool at a market stall. Finally feeling like her life isn't about to be turned upside down again. It's not glamorous history, but it's vital. And that's the odd rhythm of Frederick VI's rule. After all the calamity, his reign is basically one long national deep breath, a kind of existential spa retreat after decades of trauma. Not everyone loves him, of course. Opposition simmers beneath the surface. Liberals whisper about the need for a constitution. Merchants grumble about outdated trade laws. And the Danish press, what little of it exists, is starting to sharpen its quills. Historians still argue whether Frederick's reign is best understood as peaceful or merely stagnant. After all, this is the same king who, despite being reasonably progressive in spirit, refuses to implement a constitution. That's right. While other European nations are gradually moving toward more democratic systems, Frederick says no thanks and keeps absolute monarchy running like it's still 1740. He argues, not unreasonably, that Denmark needs stability, not upheaval. But over time, this refusal starts to look a little crusty, and yet, in other areas, he's surprisingly forward-thinking. Take his investment in scientific research. Frederick VI supports naturalists and geologists.
He helps fund expeditions. Denmark's museums grow. Libraries are built. There's even a movement to catalogue native plants, complete with botanical drawings that look like something out of a very niche colouring book. There's a quirky side project too. Danish engineers begin experimenting with windmills as industrial tools.
Not the romantic, flower-covered kind you.
Take selfies in front of no. These are clunky. Gear-filled machines that groan like old men and break constantly, but they represent a curiosity, a willingness to peer into the future. And then there's the art. This is the beginning of what
will later be known as the Danish Golden Age of cultural flowering in painting, literature, and music. Poets write of national sorrow and quiet dignity. Composers create lullabies that, if you listen closely, sound like the wind whispering through ruined stone. Painters begin depicting domestic life, not kings or battles, but small kitchens, churchyards, children in woolen socks chasing cats. It's as if the whole country is finally interested in the ordinary, and in this way, Frederick VI, so famously forgettable in grand political terms, actually becomes quietly influential. He doesn't let his people into war or revolution. He doesn't discover anything or conquer anyone.
But he gives his people room to remember who they are when no one is trying to kill them. That might not make him unforgettable, but it makes him necessary. Still, there are tensions. Political pressure continues to build. Denmark remains a rigidly autocratic state in a century moving toward liberalism. Intellectuals, clergy, and bureaucrats increasingly push for reform.
And while the king nods politely and hosts them at candlelit dinners, he never actually budges on real change. It's
like inviting someone into your home, feeding them cake, and then deadbolting the door behind them. There's also the Norway issue. Losing it wasn't just a territorial blow. It shattered the idea of Danish supremacy in the north.
Sweden now looks like the more dominant player.
The Danish ego, once plump with centuries of dual monarchy, is left trying to fit into a smaller
suit. The monarchy becomes more ceremonial, less divine, more decorative. And as for Frederick's personal life, it's complicated. He marries Princess Marie of Hesse-Kassel and has several children, but none of the sons survive to adulthood. His only surviving child is a daughter, Caroline. This causes a succession crisis. No boys,
no heir.
What now?
The laws don't allow a woman to inherit the throne, so the court begins quietly eyeing distant cousins, potential male relatives, trying to draw a line that doesn't look too ridiculous.
It's like a royal version of a group project where everyone's hoping someone else volunteers first. Meanwhile, the king grows older,
wears more grey, attends more funerals, eats more soup.
And yet, he keeps working, keeps signing documents, keeps walking the halls of his carefully balanced little kingdom like a man who knows any sudden move could tip it all over again. You can picture him quietly pacing the royal library, a fur-lined robe brushing the parquet floor, occasionally pausing to peer out the frost-rimmed windows at a capital that no longer fears bombings or bankruptcy. Just routine. One last quirky bit before we close this chapter. Frederick VI is reportedly obsessed with clocks, not metaphorically actual. Ticking clocks. His palace is filled with them. He collects them, fixes them, listens to their rhythm. Some say he finds peace in the precise tick-tick-tick of seconds sliding by, each one clean, contained, predictable. And if that's not a metaphor for his entire reign, you are not sure what is .so. Here you are, under the watch of a king whose legacy isn't carved in stone or blood, but in time measured quietly and spent carefully. No glory,
no conquest,
just order.
You are still here, floating gently through the still waters of Denmark under Frederick VI.
The noise has long faded. The cannons are silent. The diplomatic disasters have mostly aged into history.
And what's left is a kingdom learning how to live with silence. Except, of course, silence never really stays quiet, does it?
Even in this calm phase, there's a tension humming just under the surface like a teapot that's not quite boiling. And that tension is growing more noticeable.
With every passing year of Frederick's aging, heirless rule, you remember from earlier, his only surviving child is Princess Caroline. Smart, well-read, raised with all the dignity and polish expected of a royal daughter. But according to the rules of Danish succession at the time, she can't inherit the throne.
It's not personal.
It's just the deeply patriarchal law
of the land.
Thanks, tradition.so. Now we have a situation.
Frederick is getting older, and there's no clear male successor.
No little prince being taught statecraft or how to balance a ceremonial sword.
Just Caroline, politely standing in the shadows of royal ceremonies while the court starts playing a quiet game of Find a Cousin.
And eventually, they do.
And a Christian of GLCKSBURGRRGRR distantly related, politically neutral, and just bland enough to not offend anyone. Think of him like the plain cracker served with soup, not exciting, but necessary.
He's brought into
the royal circle, groomed as the likely heir, and the public is expected to smile and nod and say, yes, this makes sense. Historians still argue whether Frederick had picked Christian out of conviction or out of desperation. Either way, it sets the stage for a dynastic pivot that will echo far beyond his reign. Meanwhile, Frederick's own legacy is becoming oddly split. On one side, people remember the Regency years when he led Denmark through disaster with surprising resilience.
On the other, they see the king he became, cautious, conservative, increasingly isolated. A man whose biggest reform was occasionally hiring new schoolteachers. And then there's the issue of freedom of the press, or lack thereof. Despite being relatively enlightened in personal temperament, he reads voraciously, supports the arts,
even encourages scientific learning. Frederick is no friend to the free press. Censorship remains strict.
Political criticism is basically illegal. Publishing a snarky editorial could land you in prison or worse, in a polite but crushing bureaucratic process involving stamps and exile. In modern terms. He's the kind of guy who would love Wikipedia, but only if he could personally edit every
entry about himself. Still, there are moments of subtle rebellion. Writers begin slipping metaphors into fairy tales. Poets lace their verses with quiet sarcasm.
One particularly bold novelist publishes a romantic drama that just happens to feature a tyrannical king who hates reform.
It's all very wink wink, nudge nudge.
Denmark, it turns out, is learning how to be clever. That cleverness finds its fullest
expression in one of the most famous Danes of all time, Hans Christian Andersen.
Yes, that Andersen, the guy who brought you The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, and enough bedtime material to last several childhoods. Andersen's rise overlaps with the twilight of Frederick's reign, and while he avoids direct political
commentary, his stories tap into something deep.
A feeling of alienation, of transformation, of quiet struggle. Denmark, under Frederick VI, is a place that seems simple on the surface, but hides rich, complex undercurrents beneath. Sound familiar? So even if the king isn't personally exciting, the world he unintentionally helps create is full of imaginative energy. Back in the palace, though, things are slower.
Frederick's health begins to decline. He walks less,
attends fewer meetings. His obsession with clocks, remember that,
turns almost meditative. He sits in rooms filled with ticking, like a monk surrounded by gongs.
Visitors later say his chambers sounded like time itself was whispering to him. And yet, even in his old age, he keeps the wheels turning. One of his quieter achievements is in infrastructure.
Roads improve, postal systems expand, bridges are built.
With an eye toward longevity.
It's the kind of progress that no one celebrates in parades, but everyone notices when they no longer have to wade through a river to visit grandma. There's also an interesting, if minor, experiment in penal reform. Prisons are restructured.
Corporal punishment is limited in some areas. Work programs are introduced for inmates.
It's not exactly a revolution, but it reflects a growing interest in humanizing even the darkest parts of society. Again, Frederick. Small, slow, deliberate shifts that never make headlines but still shape lives. Yet the one shift he refuses to make is political reform. Calls for a constitution grow louder.
Inspired by movements across Europe, France, the German states, even tiny Belgium, Danish thinkers argue for representation, rule of law. Some check on royal power.
But Frederick, now nearly deaf to public opinion, just smooths his lapel and
politely ignores them. Some say it's stubbornness. Others say it's fear that changing the structure of the state might unravel everything he spent his life holding together. He remembers too well the chaos of his youth.
And so he keeps the kingdom in amber, preserved, immobile. Eventually, the inevitable happens. In 1839, after over 50 years of influence, first as regent, then as King Frederick VI dies.
Quietly.
Without a war, without an heir, without fanfare. There's a public mourning period. The streets go quiet.
Bells toll.
Court painters update his portrait to include a slight golden glow. and Denmark collectively sighs, unsure whether it's from grief or relief. Christian of GLCKSBURGRRGRR is named the next king.
He'll take the throne as Christian VIII, a new name for a new era, but one built on the same bones Frederick left behind. Frederick VI is buried with all the pomp and ceremony expected of a monarch, but his tomb, for all its carved dignity, feels strangely subdued. There are no legendary victories etched into stone, no grand phrases,
No bold claims of destiny, just a life measured in slow reforms, quiet evenings, and the steady passage of
time. His legacy? That's the open question. Some remember him as the king who kept Denmark safe during an age of fire.
others as the ruler who refused to modernize, trapping his nation in the past.
Still, others simply forget him altogether, just another name on a royal family tree. But for the people who lived through his reign, for the farmers, the poets, the children who grew up without war at their door, Frederick VI meant something quieter, and maybe more lasting. He meant peace.
So now you are lying there. The final page of Frederick VI's reign turned, and you can almost hear the hush falling over Denmark.
The sort of hush that happens after a long, exhausting symphony where the last note hangs in the air just a little too long, and nobody quite knows when to clap. Frederick is gone.
The crown has passed.
And Denmark is left blinking in the twilight, trying to figure out what just happened over the last 50-something years. Here's the strange thing. Almost immediately, people start rewriting the story. Within weeks of his
death, newspaper columns still tightly censored, of course begin to refer to him as a fatherly figure, the gentle shepherd, and even the last of the true enlightened monarchs. A bit rich, considering his strict press laws and allergic reaction to parliaments, but hey, memory is a slippery thing. Historians still argue whether this posthumous praise was genuine affection or just good manners.
Probably both.
After all, he did avoid dragging Denmark into any new wars. He did maintain some stability, and he did love ticking clocks and peaceful gardens. But the undercurrent of dissatisfaction is still there, just beneath the surface.
You don't have to dig deep into private letters, university lectures, or the quiet mutterings in Copenhagen CAFS to hear the other view, that Frederick VI's reign was, well,
boring, that he ruled like a man babysitting a fragile porcelain, full terrified it might break, and so he never really let it dance. His refusal to allow a constitution, even in his final years, becomes a major sticking point for reformers. Within a decade of his death, public pressure will grow too loud
to ignore,
and under his successor Christian VIII, who carries more progressive views in his silk-lined pockets, Denmark will slowly inch toward constitutional monarchy. But Frederick, to his last breath, never believed in such things. He saw what revolutions
had done to France. He watched Napoleon burn through Europe like a torch dropped in dry grass. He knew how easily a nation could unravel, and so he protected Denmark the only way he knew how, by wrapping it in velvet, locking the doors, and telling it bedtime stories about stability. That's the bittersweet part, isn't it?
He meant well. That much is obvious. Even his harshest critics admit he had no personal thirst for power, no cruel streak, no megalomania.
He just didn't know how to let go. Meanwhile, the world beyond Denmark kept spinning faster and faster. Railways are coming.
Steamships are transforming trade.
Telegraph wires are beginning to whisper across continents. And in this tidal wave of modernity, Denmark will need to find a new rhythm or risk drowning in its own stillness. But maybe that's why Frederick VI still matters. Not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't start wars.
He didn't execute rivals. He didn't bankrupt his people chasing some glittering imperial fantasy. He ruled for half a century with a kind of careful neutrality that, while unexciting, kept his country intact. And in a century where monarchs were dropping like dominoes, that's no small thing. Take a second and picture it. An elderly man in a starched military coat, standing in a palace that smells faintly of lavender oil and fireplace ash. Outside, the city is growing, humming, dreaming. But inside, he's pacing a carpet worn thin by decades of hesitation. He stops, looks at a clock.
It ticks, faithfully.
He nods,
then turns and disappears down a corridor lined with portraits of ancestors who fought wars, lost empires, and built
legends. Frederick VI never built a legend.
But he kept the roof from caving in, and maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of king you need in certain seasons of history. Because not every age needs a lion.
Sometimes it just needs a man who waters the roses, and so his story ends not with a bang. but with a soft exhale the kind that fogs up a window in winter, then fades before anyone notices. Still, his legacy ripples quietly onward. His daughter, Caroline, though never queen, becomes a powerful advocate for culture and charity. The educational reforms he helped see begin to blossom in future generations, and that little compromise he made bringing in Christian of GLCKSBURGRRGRRR sets in motion a new dynasty that will endure to this day. In fact, if you check Denmark's royal lineage right now, you'll find that today's monarchs trace their throne
directly through the path Frederick VI quietly laid down. The man may have faded from memory, but his fingerprints are still on the doorknobs. And what about you, listener?
You made it through his entire reign. All the clocks, all the letters, all the garden walks and polite silences. And now, here you are still awake, or maybe just barely, which means it's time for one last moment of stillness. Let's step gently
into that. So now, as the echoes of that quiet king's life settle into soft silence, you can let your breath slow. Picture yourself walking through one of Frederick's favorite gardens, those carefully trimmed hedges, the rose of late summer.
Roses, the way the sunlight glints of the cobblestones without ever really dazzling.
There's no rush here, no drama.
Just peace. You pass under an old chestnut tree, its branches creaking gently overhead. Somewhere nearby, a fountain murmurs. It's not the grand, roaring kind, it's the sort that trickles like a lullaby,
shaping there into something tender. Every now and then, a breeze wanders past, carrying the distant scent of damp earth and something faintly sweet, maybe apples, maybe just memory. And if you listen carefully, you might even hear the soft ticking of a pocket watch in someone's hand, steady, rhythmic, dependable. That's Frederick's Denmark.
Not a land of fire and conquest, but of order, routine, and a strange sort of comfort. It may not leave your heart pounding, but it wraps your thoughts in linen and tucks you in all the same. So let your shoulders soften.
Let your jaw unclench.
Let the weight of the day roll off you like fog receding from morning streets, and as the last traces of candlelight fade from the palace windows, and the king himself turns to rest in his marble silence, you too can drift, just you, the night, and the sound of the world going quiet. Sleep well.